Hey there, it is Angela, aka the Woodland Gardener, and it's late fall here, so that means it's time to get the garlic planted. In this video, I'm going to show you how I do it. Although the more years I garden, the more I realize that there's as many ways to garden as there are gardeners, it seems like. I've read that spring planting can be done for harvest later on in the year, but that the results may not be as good. I've never tried that, so I don't know. If any of you guys have tried that, let me know how it turned out. Leave a comment. Anyway, what I do is wait until fall, right around the time of the first frost. So we had our first frost on October 16th, and I got one round of garlic in on the 18th. And this year I'm doing a little experiment. So I've been wondering how much effect does delaying planting have on the results. So I did one round on the 18th, and I'm doing another today, which is October 28th. And then I'm going to wait about a week and a half and do a third round. So we'll see if that makes any difference on the results. So when you go to plant your garlic, it's always a good idea to start out with a high quality stock. I ordered my bulbs several years ago from Johnny's Selected Seeds, and I've just been growing off of that same stock ever since then. So harvest, replant, harvest, replant. I've heard varying opinions regarding using bulbs that you purchase at the grocery store, like the ones you would buy to eat. That you could run into some issues, such as the bulbs may have been treated to prevent sprouting, or if this is important to you, you wouldn't know like which variety of garlic it is. That may not be a big deal for you. Also, those bulbs may not be as high a quality or offer as much disease resistance as ones that were bred specifically for planting. Like I said, I've not tried it, and one of these years I think I will, just to see if any of those things hold up, or if it's just all a bunch of baloney and you can grow perfectly fine garlic from grocery store bulbs. Let me know if you've tried that before. I'm really curious. As I mentioned a minute ago, I am using garlic that I have been growing and then harvesting and saving some aside for replanting for the past few years. And I have two types that I'm working with. These are the only two types I've grown so far. This one is German Extra Hardy, and the second one is called Ozark. These are two different types of garlic. The German Extra Hardy is considered a hardneck variety, while the Ozark is considered a softneck variety. There are some significant differences between the two. I've covered a lot of that in a pretty thorough blog post I did, which I'll leave in a link below. So I won't go too much into that now, but I do want to point out that the hardnecks or stiff necks, they use those terms interchangeably, usually each bulb will have fewer cloves, but the cloves will be larger. So as you can see here, these are pretty sizable. Whereas the soft neck, the bulbs will have many more cloves, but the cloves are usually going to be smaller. One thing that they say to try to do, and this is what I do, is when you're pulling aside garlic bulbs to replant for next year's harvest, to make sure you choose the biggest and best of the bulbs. That way you will keep improving your stock every year. So I'm getting my garlic planted here in one of my raised beds. This is the same bed I've used for garlic for the last 3 years. Yeah, that sounds right. It's cedar and it's 3 foot by 8 foot, and I just fill the whole bed with garlic every year. And it works out pretty well, because when the garlic is harvested in mid to late summer next year, then I can do some fall leafy greens in the same bed. And then by the time those are done, I can plant new garlic. So it's a nice little cycle. The main things to keep in mind when you're selecting a location, like most veggies, it needs to get 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight, which this one does here. And then always make sure you have good drainage And start with good quality soil, and even better if you can amend your soil with some compost before you plant. So I talked about the little experiments that I'm doing with my garlic this year. This is the side that's been amended with compost and coffee grounds, and it was pretty heavily amended. I'm not sure if it really shows up that much on the video, but in person you can definitely tell a difference in the way that the soil looks because of the amendments that I did. The thing I did before I started was to weed this bed thoroughly. So it had been overgrown with a lot of weeds ever since I harvested my kale and Swiss chard out of it this year. You can see, even though I weeded the whole bed, there's already new ones popping up. So I'm trying to keep tabs on that, and definitely before I do any more planting of the next rounds of garlic, I'll get all the rest of those weeds out. So in case I wasn't really clear, I am doing 2 different experiments with my garlic planting this year. The first one is half of the bed has been amended heavily, very heavily, with compost and coffee grounds mixed in. And that is the side that is closest to me here, right there. And the other experiment that I'm doing is regarding the timing of the plantings, which I talked about at great detail earlier. So within each half, the amended half and the non-amended half, I've broken it down into 3 sections. You can see I use those little wooden stakes to kind of be a visual separation between not only amended and not amended, but between first, second, and third planting in each half. So I hope that made sense. I'm trying to keep it as controlled as possible. So regarding spacing and how far apart the cloves should be from each other when you plant them. So like with a lot of things in gardening, I've read a lot of different preferences on how far apart to plant them. So I've read that the cloves should be planted 5 to 6 inches apart in rows that are anywhere from 8 to 12 inches apart, which seems like a lot of, right, that's like a wide range, at least I think it is. And so what I ended up doing last year, so my first couple years of planting, frankly, I can't remember how I did the spacing, but what it came down to was that last year I tried just planting them each 6 inches apart from each other in a grid pattern. So I didn't necessarily plant in rows. I just put them all down on the soil in like a checkerboard pattern, each one about 6 inches apart from the others. And it seemed to work out. So that's how I'm doing it again this year, and I'll just keep doing that until it fails, I guess. Or maybe that could be like another little experiment to try another year. I like to do when I'm planting things that I need to know how far apart they are, and but they go completely into the ground, so there's no way to know like where you put the last one or whatever. I hope that made sense. Like bulbs fall into that category, whereas if you're planting a seedling, you can see exactly where it is because it's sticking up out of the ground. But in order to maintain spacing, I go ahead and lay out all my bulbs that I'm putting in that grid pattern, so you can kind of see far back. There's 2, then 1, then 2, then 1, then 2. And if I was doing this planting them all at the same time, this whole bed would be laid out in that grid pattern. But since I'm doing my little experiment, I just have this one little row here demarcated by these wooden stakes that are just meant to be just a loose visual on where the first planting went in, then the second planting, then in a week or so I'll do the third planting in that third strip there. So, but back to what I'm doing today, I've got all my bulbs laid out, so they are ready to go into the ground now. So it's time to dig them into the ground, and sort of like with spacing, I've read multiple guidelines, if you will, of how deep to plant them. And a lot of that depends on which zone you're in, what your climate is like. Here, the recommendation is 2 to 4 inches. So that's what I shoot for. So I dig my hole about 2 to 4 inches. Oh, and by the way, I'm in zone 6. So 2 to 4 inches is my recommendation. If you're gonna plant garlic, I would suggest looking it up what the recommendation is for where you live to make sure you get them to the optimum depth. So when you go to plant, you want to make sure that this pointy end is facing up, and there will be a flatter end. Bring this in, I don't know if you can see that. So there's a flat end and then the pointy end. Pointy end goes up. That's where the new growth will come from. So you get it down into the hole, then cover it back over with the soil, kind of tamp it down. And then I'll just do the same for all of these other bulbs, cloves that is. I tend to use those interchangeably, bulb and clove, when obviously they are different. So I'm going to carry on with this and I will be back. So I've got all my cloves in for my second planting, and the next step is to give these a good gentle watering to help them get settled in, help them start establishing roots. So stick around for that. So for watering, like I said, it's just a gentle watering. You don't have to soak them, just enough to reach down a few inches into the soil and help them get established. And for us here, I'm in southern Ohio, fall is generally pretty rainy season for us, even though it hasn't been extremely rainy this fall. Fall seems to be a little bit kind of delayed this year. We've been having a mild fall, but I'm sure that the rain is coming. Given the second section some water. And with all the hurricanes that the poor southeastern region has been having, generally when that happens, a couple days later, we see the rain from that. Sometimes in the form of storms and then sometimes just rain. So right now I think there's a hurricane that's kind of quote unquote in the works. I haven't been following it too closely, but this is maybe the third or fourth one that they've been hit with this year. My heart goes out to them. The last thing that we do after getting the cloves in the ground is to lay down a layer of mulch, and usually that'll be straw or shredded leaves. I think those are the two most common things that people use. I've used straw for the past 2 years, and I'll just keep using that again this year, as much as I'm tempted to use shredded leaves, because I love shredded leaves. I use them in my compost and help to enrich the soil. But with the other two little experiments I've got going on, I'm afraid that introducing another change would mean that if it worked or didn't work, I wouldn't know what made it work or not work. I wouldn't know what effect changing the leaves had on, because it wouldn't be very controlled. So the recommended depth of mulch is 4 to 6 inches. And again, this could be something that depends on where you live. We tend to get a pretty decent winter. We'll usually get a few snowfalls and sometimes a heavy snowfall, but not every year. We do definitely get freezing temperatures, and some winters it could even go into the negatives. Maybe -5 would be the coldest. That's pretty rare though. Usually you'll get into single digits, but not below 0. But it swings wildly from winter to winter. You never know what to expect. So anyway, what the mulch does, relating this to the winter, is that it will protect your cloves from heaving out of the ground during freeze and thaw cycles. So that's one benefit to laying a pretty thick layer of straw on your soil. And the other thing it does is to act as a weed suppressant. And regarding what to do with the mulch when spring rolls around, uh, again, there are differing schools of thought on that. Some folks say that as soon as the weather warms up enough, maybe around the time of your first frost, sorry, make that the last frost, that you should go ahead and take the mulch off. Otherwise, it could present a risk of rot and disease because it holds too much moisture in. And then another school of thought says to leave the mulch on because it acts as a weed barrier and it can help retain moisture. So those both seem like very valid points to me. So what I've done in the past couple of years is sort of use a hybrid approach. As soon as the temperatures are warm enough in the spring, I'll pull most of the straw off and leave a thin layer. So I don't have to worry about moisture retention issues, but it still provides a little bit of a weed suppression barrier. So what do you guys do? Let me know, leave a comment. So that's it for now. I hope that you found this helpful, and if you did, give it a like and I'd greatly appreciate it. Happy gardening to you.